This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin, and with me this week, just one person who I enjoy to talk to about comic books. That is Nick White.
Hey.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. We are here to talk about a very special comic book to our hearts, a comic that we've been journeying through together as a strange pair of individuals into this terrible horror hellscape that is Ice Cream Man. Today we are talking about Ice Cream Man Volume 4, Tiny Lives. This is a full-blown spoiler alert for Ice Cream Man Volume 4. This is issues 13 through 16. So if you haven't read them, stop this podcast, go read them, and then turn this episode back on. But Nick, can we just go into this issue saying, what the fuck, as always?
Yeah, I think that's always the resounding takeaway. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I, we read this pretty recently. It came out a little while ago, but I think we both had the chance to sit down and read this for this episode. I mean, this is, as always, W. Maxwell Prince with Martin Morazzo, Chris O'Halloran on colors, and good old Neon on letters. This is maybe one of the most anthology-esque volumes yet. I think compared to the previous 3 volumes, this one in particular for me felt the most like an anthology horror series, and I'm wondering if maybe that's what we're getting back to. Did the continuity go away? What were your thoughts, just high level really quick, before we dig into each of the issues?
Yeah, something I was thinking about yesterday was sort of when you look at these sets of issues as trades and as volumes, and sort of how they interact with each other. Because I think one of the initial things that I'll say high level about Volume 4 is in some ways I kind of struggled with where to place it amongst everything else. And I think kind of the conclusion I came to was that, like, with each subsequent volume, like if you've read Volume 1 and you're about to read Volume 2, a lot of the ideas in Volume 2, and not even like the story or the narrative, but in terms of the tone and the tropes and the structure, like the next volume relies on you having the knowledge of the tropes and the structure of the previous volume, but it's but it's also going to subvert them. So it relies on the knowledge, but it's also not going to give you more of that. It's going to subvert it. And so I think, like, if Volume 1 set up a lot of these things, I think that kind of gave Volume 2 sort of the freedom to flesh out some of those ideas. And then I think 3 was more about giving you prologue, giving you sort of a prequel-esque sort of back history, giving you interaction between Caleb and Ice Cream Man. And then, yeah, the question for me is, like, how do you feel about Volume 4? What does it build upon? And I think for me, the TLDR version would be that W. Maxwell Prince now knows that because you've made it through these other 3 volumes, you're comfortable with, maybe comfortable's the wrong word, I'm not sure it makes anybody comfortable, you're familiar with how much he likes to play with form. And I think that is a lot of what Volume 4 is about. You're right, it's very anthology oriented. It's definitely a step away from Volume 3 in that regards, but it's really about him playing with form. And I think people that maybe really dug Volume 3 for what it was, maybe they're not going to like Volume 4 as much. Just an idea.
I mean, I almost wonder if you like Volume 3 for some of the maybe continuity stuff, maybe you'll like Volume 4 because of the anthology portion that you got similar in Volume 1, right? Like Volume 1 was just a series of random stories, and we didn't really get any continuity until I think the last issue of that volume. And so, I think maybe they're going in every other volume kind of thing. I don't know, but let's dig into this volume on the whole, right? Like Volume 4 starts with what I remember being this iconic palindrome issue. I remember seeing people talk about it online. I think there was even like an idea of like, this is what an Eisner nominated issue is supposed to be like. And I remember W. Maxwell Prince talking about this being like a really challenging issue to write. So, going into this, there's a big disclaimer on this issue that says this comic is a palindrome. It can be read forwards from first to last or backwards from last to first, which means that if you're reading it forward, you read it from left to right, top to bottom. But if you're reading it backward, you're supposed to read it right to left, bottom to top. which I have to imagine that if you bought this single issue, you'd be very confused. But I like that in the digital edition, which is what I read as a volume, they printed the comic and then they printed it backwards, or maybe it was actually done that way in both situations. I don't know. But Nick, what was your takeaway from this first issue? Because I want to go through this one in particular issue by issue, because I think it warrants that, because there's a bigger story thing that I want to get to in the end. So this palindrome thing was wild, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it did run the danger with me of being maybe like it had a lot of hype and praise to live up to, right? Because we were hearing some of this news as it was rolling out as a single issue. And then, of course, we heard more of it when it got rolled out as a trade. And then sort of it kind of snowballed in terms of praise. And so it had a lot to live up to. I think what's really interesting is because you have this preface right out of the gate, like you can read this issue both ways, and with the implicit assumption of, well, you're probably going to read it front to back at the very least first, assuming you even read it both ways.
Sure.
I think having that warning first, it's useful to have it in terms of like dealing with confused readers, right? But I think also having that warning plants a seed in readers' minds that while you're reading this issue, or at least it did for me, I recognize I'm not normal, quote unquote. Like it planted the seed in my mind of, while you're reading this, think about this issue in terms of the fact that it can be flipped, right? So when I was reading that first page, and it's this big splash page, and there's just like a 1-sentence caption, my brain was automatically going to, imagine that this is now the final panel of a story. You know, what does that mean? What does that what does that sound like to you? How does that shape how you're reading this? Like it was kind of an interesting way to sort of twist your brain into a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Which I really liked. It's interesting that this issue includes a lot of language that can kind of double as both being like colloquial turns of phrase as well as being deliberately directional. So at one point, Paul is told about his life. You know, Paul is dealing with the death of his spouse, and people are telling Paul that he needs to move forward. Which, of course, if you're reading the issue front to back, you also have this directional kind of speech going on there. There's another spot where he's told that there's just one way to go, which of course is kind of interesting because when we're referring to this issue, there's not just one way to go. It can be read either way. So you kind of have this directional talk going on, and then the rest of the issue really gets framed with this idea that Paul, again, if you're reading it, you know, or at least my experience was, he finds this manhole in his front yard. The manhole cover ominously says underground. The ice cream man truck is parked right outside, and of course he decides that he's going to go down the manhole seeking answers. I think he says he's going to get answers from the king of the underworld, I think is the phrase that's used.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting from there is that you have a lot of panels that are very carefully, and that's probably even an understatement, very carefully constructed to be read both ways. So when you have him holding a balloon in the middle of like an open space and he's floating, is he ascending or is he descending, right?
Right, and that all depends on the panel order, of course, which I thought was really interesting that they had done a mirror image flip of a lot of these pages, which I want to talk about more, but continue your thought and then I'll go into
and in the same way, you have panels where Paul is on a ladder, and is he going up or is he going down? And then when you look at the caption on the panel, it says something like back and forth or up and down. So depending upon which way you're reading the comic, W. Maxwell Prince has sort of given himself some leeway in terms of the captioning still being correct, no matter which way you're reading the comic, which is so clever.
Yeah, and I think that's the genius of this. And I one thing that I was thinking about was, this isn't just a mirror image flip of the story, right? This isn't necessarily like you fold something in half and then it gets represented, and now right becomes left and left becomes right. This is a full swap where the top becomes the bottom, and so on and so forth when they do the printed version of the palindrome. Because the thing that this made me think of was there's a chapter in Watchmen that uses this similar technique. Like, it doesn't necessarily supposed to be read front to back to front, but in Watchmen, and this is the only book that I can think of, someone out there at me if you know of another example, where Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore, they had come up with an issue where if you folded each page on top of its like opposite, right? So page 1 and page 22, the panel layout would be the same if you ran them face to face to each other. I thought that it's a really interesting thing with like even the action, even the thought, even the bubbles and captions and stuff all line up for the most part. But this is not that. This is a full flip in reverse, right? Like top becomes bottom, left becomes right, and the only thing that doesn't change is the text. And I should say the imagery doesn't change within the panels, but the layout of the page changes it. And because of that, it allows you to have a completely different tone and look at the issue. Now, I thought that both, forward and backward were pretty depressing because this is Ice Cream Man and it's not like we really get many happy endings at all.
Right.
Though it seems like the, reading from back to front was a little bit more uplifting, but kind of cynical. Right? Like the ending becomes, well, that's one way to go. Move forward, Paul. People sure love to give advice. Like that to me seems a little bit more uplifting. Like this dude came out of hell and realized that he could live his life. But I don't know. There's a lot to take away from this, which is going to kind of play into a bigger point. But was there anything else you wanted to talk about at this palindrome issue, Nick? I mean, because it's ultimately creepy, and even characters within the story use palindromes in their speech, which I didn't catch the first time I read through it. It took like when I read the first direction, I didn't realize it, but then when I got to the reverse, I was starting to look for more and more palindromes, and there's plenty of them throughout.
Yeah, I didn't. Despite the issue being titled Palindromes, it never clicked with me that the reason a lot of the speech seemed so weird and nonsensical was because it was palindromes. Yeah, I just chalked that up to crazy. Yeah, the one thing I kind of took away or sort of focused on was the fact that I kind of framed the issue in my mind as sort of, you can work at this from the front or you can work at this from the back. Like, my kind of thing I focused on was what happens when the two meet, like what happens at the center.
Oh, yeah.
And what's interesting is that there's one panel at the middle that is shared by both forward and backward. If you're reading it forward or you're reading it backward, each one mirrors the other in the sense of having the exact same panels. As you said, they're rearranged, but each has its own respective panel mirroring the other, except at the very middle of the book where they share the same panel. And yes, in some ways, if you split the panel down the middle, there is some symmetry, but it's not a perfect symmetry. And I thought that was kind of interesting too.
By a long shot, I don't think there's a little bit of symmetry.
You have both Pauls in the lower left-hand corner of the panel and the other one in the lower right-hand corner of the panel. And if you take the throne and you split it down the middle, there's some symmetry. But yeah, if you look at the faces. But the blood splatter is
the blood splatter isn't.
It's not.
The faces aren't. And I was curious to think, are some of these faces people from different issues, from previous issues? I want to say yes.
My mind went to the exact same place, and offhand, without revisiting previous volumes, I thought maybe I noticed one or two, but not a lot. I think you have the story in the first issue of the two people that are like, I think they're like heroin users, if you remember this. And the boyfriend of the two survives. I think his face was on the right-hand side of the throne in about the middle.
Okay.
But I certainly didn't see other ones where I immediately thought, oh, I know these people. So I didn't know what to make of that. But I think that there's something to be said about, there's this throne. Presumably it's the throne of the king of the underworld. It's the person that Paul was going to get answers from, and the throne is empty and he has no one to address. So make of that what you will. I think there's probably some deeper interpretation there to go into. I just don't know what to say about it myself. I think it's also interesting
Yeah.
tonally that this issue kind of has a different take than, say, an issue like Triptych, where it's the idea that you can make decisions and end up in very different places than if you'd made
Right.
different decisions. And yet this issue sort of feels more like regardless of what you do, you will end up in the same place, or you will end up there's sort of like an inevitability with this issue, an unavoidability of things. So
right, which definitely goes against some of the stuff that we've seen in previous issues. And I don't know if W. Maxwell Prince has like a long game in mind, but he does have a tendency to just kind of blend different story types to fit within this universe. And I wonder if there is a bigger answer that we're going to see. I think there is, because I was skimming through part of Volume 3, specifically the issue where we see like the old man and Caleb and Rick, the ice cream man, and the old man dies, right? And he tells Rick that like all of this is like matters, or all of this is one story. And I don't know if that's supposed to be taken, literally or something. But as the old man dies in or out in the desert, maybe this is in Volume 2.
No,
maybe I'm thinking Volume 2.
I think this is 3. He said, eager to be proven
it
wrong.
Is 3. Yeah, it is 3. And this old man, he is killed by Rick, and he says to him, "On to the next one, Caleb. Everything is one thing," which like I think was a big question when we read the last volume anyways. So again, it's not to detract too much, but like, yeah, it seems like there is something that I think W. Maxwell Prince is trying to explain with continuity, and we just haven't gotten the answer yet. I think if we go into some of the next stories, maybe we can explore that further.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you wanted to mention about this first issue? I realize it's probably the big whammy in this volume, but
right.
I know these next ones have some pretty cool points.
Yeah, I mean, the final thought I would say is when I finished it, I think my kind of takeaway in some ways was, gee, it seems like Ice Cream Man really isn't that present in this issue. He doesn't seem to maybe be pulling strings. I found that kind of interesting. His presence seems kind of diminished. And I think I sort of took that idea with me as I started visiting these other stories. Sure.
I mean, and it's, yeah, we'll see as we get into the next few ones. Like Ice Cream Man's presence in this volume is actually pretty minimal. But so moving on to issue number 14, this is Down and Across, which has a wonderful cover, with a little bit of a crossword of sorts on the front, which is pretty fun. And yeah, we have a story about a man and his wife who don't really talk anymore. They have some bit of marital trouble, as we find out. And the man's wife, she begins to hallucinate. Her name is Rita. She begins to hallucinate that the people that are building their guest house are murderous, rampaging folks. She's freaking out about one of them not wearing a shirt.
"Quote unquote" hallucinate.
Yeah, quote unquote hallucinate, which we'll get into. And the husband runs out to go get more crosswords, where he runs into Ice Cream Man, and things kind of come to a head as he begins to hallucinate some awful things about their past, including their child dying as a stillborn. And Rita begins to see more hallucinations, and as the husband runs home, he starts to see all sorts of bad things, and she almost shoots him. And the story ends almost in a happy note. I don't know, Nick. What do you think? I have a thought about this, because on the whole, we've seen these, black void-eyed terrors, I think in previous issues.
Right.
But I mostly just really love the panel layouts in this, where the entire thing kind of feels like a giant crossword puzzle. But yeah, what were your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, first off, this is one of those issues that if you have an eye for details, you're going to go insane, or you're going to love it. I guess take that however you want. For me, in some ways, this story somewhat falls into other ones we've seen in volumes, especially volumes 1 and 2, where it's sort of a be careful what you wish for kind of thing. We've seen this in other stories with like the musician who always wanted to be a star. I think that was volume 1. And in this one, we have this guy who just wants to do his crosswords. and he goes to the store and to the Five and Dime, which I'm sure some readers caught. The store right next to the Five and Dime is named O'Halloran's, which I thought was kind of funny, given that that's the colorist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I did notice some other interesting little details. When Earl is initially doing the crossword, we get a glimpse of it, and most of the answers are cut off or cropped out, except for the phrase lickety split.
Yeah.
Also, if you look a little bit closer, even though these clues are somewhat cut off, I think we can parse that one of them is the word ambulance, which is an interesting callback to the end of Volume 2 for pretty obvious reasons. And there's also the word kill, which, I mean, you can't do much about that. And what do you want? I mean, like, that's this book. But yeah, you're right. The wife Rita is mad because contractors working on their house are smoking doobies while they're working on it. Earl says that doesn't matter because, who cares about having a guest house if you're never going to have any guests? And then that just devolves from there, exactly as you would expect an argument too. Of course, Ice Cream Man is running the Five and Dime. This is pretty much all we see of him in this story. He's not in it for very long. It's also kind of interesting because I think in a lot of previous stories, there's usually a panel or a cutaway or something that hints at a slightly more sinister Ice Cream Man, or it's sort of that like turn to camera shot and he, shows a glimpse of his weird teeth or something like that. And we just don't have those many moments that are like that in this book. I think he's pretty quote unquote normal, which is a little bit, disconcerting and weird.
Well, he's kind of just present in the background of the story. Like, he doesn't need to, it doesn't seem like he needs to have like overt influence on something. Or maybe, and this kind of begs a bigger question, like, his presence is so prevalent that he doesn't need to be involved in these little scenarios because these things just sort of happen on their own. There's kind of a question there because while Earl is having interactions with him at the Five and Dime, like, where is Rita's interaction with him that would cause her to hallucinate? And that kind of begs a bigger question of where these horrors are coming from, because there's nothing that gives us a reason to why she would be hallucinating unless it's something about these guys that are working on the house, and maybe she is realizing something because there's kind of an ambiguity at the end that these guys maybe are as bad as she thinks they are. So, because they drive off in the end and they have the masks on again, and one of them has like these black eyes, one of them has green eyes like Ice Cream Man. He's got a mask, and there's a third guy with a mask on. So I don't know. It kind of begs a bigger question that I think we talked about in Volume 2, which is, how much has Ice Cream Man taken over this town or this city, which to me actually asks another question of, is it just one town? Is it just one city? Because I think in Volume 3, we see that he's in like Costa Rica or something. He's in like a South American
we see him on
country.
the border. There's the story
the
called
border,
like a border story
true.
or something like that.
You're right. Sorry. I don't know why I said Costa Rica. It was clearly Mexico. I'm just an idiot.
Well, we also have the story with the big corporate office in the skyrise sort of skyscraper where everybody's going mad, and we know that that's like supposed to be several towns over or something like that. But but I see your point. Yeah. No, I think this story kind of goes to some interesting places. We do see that Earl chooses to do this crossword, and unfortunately a lot of the crossword seems to be about relationship problems, about sort of personal tragedies within his own life. And so we have a lot of things like that. And simultaneously, you as you said, you have Rita becoming increasingly more and more paranoid that something is going on with these contractors, to the point that she believes that they are going to try to kill her. Interestingly, simultaneously, both Earl and Rita decide that their problem is going to be remedied with a gun. Which I thought was interesting. They both arrive kind of at the same thought, but with very different intentions about what to do with that item. I thought that was curious. Obviously, Earl is thinking about shooting himself. Rita is thinking about shooting the contractors. And they both arrive at the gun, which is really also interesting. I don't know if you caught this throughout the issue. Earl says something about how he likes the crossword because it forces his vocabulary to move outside of the normal, boring, banal day-to-day terms that are thrown at him, like fixed rate mortgage or something like that. And one of those terms is like, nightstand, gun in nightstand or something like that. Like it's mentioned earlier in the issue.
I did not notice that.
Yeah, one of the terms dropped is like nightstand gun or something like that, which I thought was, almost like Chekhov's gun, right? Like, you've got to reveal it in the third act. So both kind of arrive at that at the same time. And I think, I mean, I don't know. Like I struggle with the story because I think Earl's part makes sense in a way, in the twisted way that these narratives tend to go, because it's sort of forcing someone to rehash personal tragedy. That's pretty much a common theme with a lot of these stories. Giving something, be careful what you wish for. Another pretty common theme in these stories. What you make of Rita's tale, I think, is what gets trickier. For me, I kind of look at it as, she criticizes the crossword puzzle. She says it's a waste of time. He's not getting out there, meeting people, socializing. I think she says something like, when was the last time you talked with Ted, whomever Ted is? But at the same time, I think what we're seeing is that she is also kind of bored, and she's reached that point where she's just maybe trying to find things to obsess over. She's trying to find things to be upset about. And so for me, I kind of interpret her dealing with the contractors as sort of like she's looking for things to be unhappy about, or she's looking for things to be upset about or to fixate on. And I think in that regard, maybe, she says, Earl, what you're doing isn't great, but she doesn't seem to be actively engaging herself in, keeping herself busy either.
Sure.
Of course, what gets tricky is like, what do you make of the fact that these guys seemingly try to kill her, or that they suddenly like transform into like their Mad Max alter egos, right?
Right.
With that weird mask and shit. And what do you make of that? I don't know.
Well, that seems to be like a, I don't know, like a classic Ice Cream Man influence. The thing that I thought was interesting was kind of the break in the story. Not to completely just like move off of that piece, but the thing that I was just skimming through here again, and I forgot that I had noticed this last night. There is a moment where Earl is doing crosswords, and anytime we see that like Times New Roman in caption, usually that's Ice Cream Man narrating something, right? And so he's narrating, talking about Earl, and then at one point Earl is sitting down on a park bench doing his crossword, and he starts to hear Ice Cream Man's voice. And I think that's where the story starts to really kind of kick into high gear to wrap itself up, where Earl starts questioning these captions, like whose voice is that? Who's there? And he starts talking to the captions. And I think we've seen that in previous issues where someone suddenly realizes that that there is a voice out there that's narrating their lives, right? This kind of semi-omniscient narrator becomes like actively aware by the characters become aware of it. There is an intention there, right? Is Ice Cream Man trying to break down a wall in that moment, and suddenly the characters are aware of it because Ice Cream Man clearly isn't omniscient. He doesn't know everything that's going to happen, or he's not omnipotent, or whatever you want to call it.
Well,
right?
It's also interesting because
omnipotent.
When you have Ice Cream Man doing that, he starts, after you have Earl on the bench, Ice Cream Man starts saying like, oh, like what's a 6-letter word for, when your daughter was born, or things like this. And so Ice Cream Man starts dictating these terms, right? And he says, solve this puzzle, give me the answer to this, tell me what this means. And there's a point where Earl snaps out of it, and Earl says something like, oh, like what's a 4-letter word? I shouldn't be doing this. What's a 4-letter word for where I belong? Or, there's no place like whatever. And so Earl flips the script on Ice Cream Man, and he starts coming up with his own questions that he wants to answer, which I thought was interesting. And so you have this moment where Earl kind of flips the script and says, no, like, I'm going to call the terms on this.
Right. I mean, and this maybe even begs a question of, is this somebody pushing back against Ice Cream Man for really the first time and succeeding? Because by the end of this issue, you know, both Earl and Rita are fine. Right. There's
outside
just
of the
this
fact
whole...
that one nearly murders the other. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, right. But all things considered, you know, compared to a lot of other stories, especially some even in this issue or in this volume,
Right.
like these two people end up mostly okay. I mean, compared to a lot of others. So is this an example of someone just getting one over on Ice Cream Man, or was the actual story about these, you know, three contractors suddenly becoming influenced with, you know, evil powers, which is kind of what we see at the end?
Well, it also kind of has that element, which I think we've seen in other stories, which is that Ice Cream Man simultaneously with people is sometimes trying to it's like a really twisted like fable, because he's trying to make people learn maybe about something that they're doing in their life that is unhealthy or that maybe needs to change, but then also he's totally okay with and completely on board with you know, sometimes you learn the lesson but it kills you, or you figure things out but it's too late, right? Like we've seen this with other narratives, and I can't immediately think of one that comes to mind, but yeah, in this one you have this idea of, you know, the Rita and Earl, you know, coming to terms with the fact that, you know, maybe they need to change up or put more effort into their relationship or something like that, right? Of course, the thing is that in coming to that realization, they do ultimately, you know, nearly kill one another or themselves. So, and that, of course, is something Ice Cream Man is totally okay with.
Yeah.
The other thing I would point out in this issue, and I think I'm just going to briefly mention it here because I think you're going to see a lot more of it in subsequent stories, and I think we can talk about it also as an overall overarching theme at the end, is that you start to see a real ubiquity for Ice Cream Man branding. It is
ICM is all over
everything now. When you go into the Five and Dime, it's on, like, I don't even know what to describe it. Like, I think we've all seen like those like mini like portable cooler thingies in like gas stations where they're like filled with ice and they're only like 3 feet tall. And it's just like one on like wheels, and you push it around and they fill it with ice and they put pops in it. Like there's one of those that says Ice Cream Man. The advertising panel over the top of the cashier station, that says Ice Cream Man. There's like a little, you know, the gimmicky shit that you see like on the cashier's counter that you can buy right at the register, and it's like lighters or batteries or whatever. Like there's little what look like Ice Cream Man lighters, and those say ICM. You're seeing a lot of this, and as this trade goes on, you are just going to see more and more and more and more of this. And I think that there's an overarching argument to be made about that.
Well, yeah, I think let's just get into the next issue with that, because it's all over the next issue in the fourth, the last issue in this volume, and I think that maybe is them trying to explain the pervasiveness of Ice Cream Man. Like he is everywhere, he's in everything, he's on newspapers,
he's unchallenged and unchecked.
Yeah, and he's become a part of the social norm.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think these horrors or anything that are normal, but I think that his influence is part of everything. And maybe that's what they're trying to say there. And maybe that's what this volume is. Like, these people are experiencing these things because Ice Cream Man, like I said before, doesn't have to be involved directly with any of these things. No. Instead, it's just his presence is so pervasive that it's a part of
the shit's kind of on autopilot now. Yeah, it's driving itself.
Which I guess, gets us into this next issue called, Coat Story Check, where a woman finds a coat and then goes crazy at the end, right? That's all the story
Coat Check story for me, offhand, is probably the one that I quote unquote understand the least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Explain.
Yeah.
Explain.
There was a lot here that I didn't know how to parse, and I think there's a lot of meaning laden in this issue that I really didn't know what to do with. So at the core, the issue involves this woman named Lillian, and she is on a date towards the beginning of the issue, which she cuts out on, goes to get her coat from the coat check station, which is run by Ice Cream Man. And he offers her a coat that is not hers, and she's pretty dang well aware that it's not hers. Unsurprisingly, it's a little hard to read, but if you zoom in on the label on the coat, it does say ICM, which will probably surprise nobody. And of course, what I think is interesting is that, as I said, it's not an issue of it being a super similar coat, and she just takes it. She's fully well aware that it is not her coat. Says something to the extent of, oh, I just needed a new coat anyways, and takes it. And yeah, that's not a good way to sort of garnish sympathy right out of the gate for this person. Yeah. We sort of follow her as she goes walking, I think, through the city to go visit, I believe, her mom. No, I'm sorry. Well, she's going back to a friend's house.
Right. Yeah, well, I think it's like her current friends with benefits that she's with.
Exactly.
And then the next day she has to go visit her mom after she has a horrible nightmare where her friend / lover tries to jump her in the middle of the night with a mask on, mind you. Note, there's a mask in this one too.
And note that it's aesthetically similar and yet not the same to the Mad Max / Fallout one that we see towards the end of issue 14. Right. What does one make of that? I don't know. I don't know, other than that it is a recurring imagery. That's it.
Yeah. I have a theory, but let's get through the rest of this issue, and then, we can talk about that, because, Lillian, she has to go, visit her mom to give her a bath, and her mom is focused on all these various items. And at the beginning of this issue, we see, Lillian in a mental asylum, right, or a mental institution, and she's kind of chiming on about some weird things, focusing on objects. And when we finally see her mom in this flashback, her mom's doing the exact same thing, right. And it is very sad, yes, to say the least. Yeah.
And her mom has this teddy bear with the Ice Cream Man hat on it, which you will see, I think finds its way into 3 out of the 4 stories in this book, which is interesting.
I did not notice that.
Oh, yeah. It's...
I should say I didn't put that together.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, she's seeing these different things. I think there's commentary about bugs. She sees this boy that's carrying a balloon and tells her, you shouldn't, quote, you shouldn't wear someone else's jacket, Lillian, which, I mean, solid advice.
Oh, yeah, there was a finger in the pocket of the jacket.
Right, which is also interesting because there's a moment when she's talking to her mom, and her mom says, oh, yeah, this nice boy came over here with a balloon. We were playing games. One of these games was counting to 10 on our fingers, but I could only count to 9, which I immediately went, okay, there's going to be a finger somewhere down the line. Sure enough, there is. It's in the pocket of the coat. What do we make of all of this? I don't know. I think if there's like an overarching kind of theme or universal idea that we sort of hit at, that I think W. Maxwell Prince knows will ring true for a lot of people, it's maybe the fear that we grow up to resemble or become our parents, whether that's in terms of attitudes or behavior, or in terms of genetics, in terms of, if our family members were dealing with some, malady of one sort or another, the fear that we too will face that, and whether or not maybe even that becomes like self-fulfilling, I don't know. Because I think in some ways in this story, you wonder about how exactly that's playing out for Lillian. So Yeah, there's a lot of other stuff to dig into. When Lillian runs onto the subway, I don't know if you saw this, but on the steps running down into the subway, there's like messages, and it says something
Oh
about
yeah,
like, "Are
want
you
help?
having hallucinations too?" or something like that. And then there's a
Yeah, it's like
billboard on the back wall of the subway, which is mostly blocked by like the girders or whatever holding the subway up, but you can still get the letters ICM and then a bow tie symbol.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's ICM is all over the place. I mean, Lillian ends up in a room in this somehow in the subway that the boy with the balloon points her towards, and it's a million different versions of Lily in the same coat. I mean,
Largely different hair colors.
Yeah, they all have different hair colors, and I think they kind of represent like different realities to a certain extent. That's what I took from it. So I don't know because there's this. By the time that we get to the end of this, the boy is back with the balloon, and he says, "Come, your throne waits, sit and be queen of the lilies." Like she is the final version of all of herselves or something. I don't know what necessarily to take away from that. My overall thought was that, she worries that she's going to become her mother, and then she does. And that's like fear playing into itself.
Right.
Simply because you thought it and you wanted to avoid it, therefore it became that thing, versus not worrying about it. So but the end of the issue ends with this field of lilies covered in bugs, which again, Ice Cream Man, bugs, destruction, chaos, all this stuff. I don't know, it's wild. This issue again kind of plugs into this idea that I have, that this whole volume is about images becoming reality, or like mirrors distorting reality. But we can get into that in a second before we get to the next issue, I guess, or after we get to the next issue.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the only other thing I would say about this is it is kind of interesting that when she first meets the boy with the balloon, he accuses her of being from the garden underground, I think is the phrase thrown around, which I think
underground again.
Well, yes, there is sort of a theme of the underground, which is interesting, especially because that's where a lot of bugs are, and we know about how much Ice Cream Man loves bugs. It's interesting for me because I understood when I finished the story and revisited that, I understood that the boy with the balloon was basically saying something to the effect of, "Hey, don't you belong with all of the other Lillians? In the garden underground," whatever you want to call that place. He's basically saying, like, aren't you supposed to be with the rest of them? And of course, you don't understand what that is until you finish the story. As for what to make of the dozens of lilies, I didn't know what to extrapolate from that, but
well, there's I think just kind of reflecting on it now, Lily in the subway, there's a bunch of different hair colors that she's wearing, and they all have coats on. And if you look at the last page of this issue, there's a bunch of different lilies in a field, all with similar colors. So I'm wondering if there's some imagery, message that I'm just not, or metaphor that I'm not picking up, especially with Ice Cream Man's final line in this issue being, "Thistles must be cut down before they flower." I don't fucking know enough about flowers to be able to
there's a
speak
lot
to
of flower verbiage in this issue that I don't know what to make of. It's also, it's worth noting that there's a lot of crossword puzzle imagery that finds its way into this issue. If you look at the shirt that Lillian's wearing on the date, it's definitely looks like a crossword puzzle. Also,
especially on the cover too.
Yeah, and if you look at the painting in her lover's apartment, that also looks like a crossword puzzle. If you look at I think it's the rug at her mom's house, it also looks like a crossword puzzle. I mean, yeah, Nick, is it just checkerboard patterns or vaguely resembling checkerboard patterns? Sure, but it's hard to ignore.
Right. There's a rug. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I didn't even notice that in my first read. This is kind of like, anyways, yeah, this is getting to that whole mirroring thing, right? Like things, even at the end of the crossword issue, there's this weird palindrome image or whatever you call it, that something you could fold across from each other. It's like mirrored, both vertical and horizontally. there's definitely something that I think he's trying to say in this volume about like reversing images and like things that reflect upon themselves,
or even like what sort of
um
meaning do you pull from repeated imagery, right? Like what
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
like meaning are you creating, possibly what sort of meaning are you self-creating out of recurring imagery? Because yeah, once you start finding, you say, oh, this looks like a checkerboard pattern, and then you see Lillian's shirt and you're like, oh, that looks like a checkerboard pattern, and then you're like, with the
hmm
painting, you're like, well, it's close enough, so I'm going to loop it in, and then you're like, well, the rug doesn't look exactly like it, but it's still close enough, so it's sort of I think in some ways, W. Maxwell Prince has gotten in your head to start hunting out this imagery and then asking, like, what meaning are you providing this?
yeah.
Um,
Well, I'm sure there's some sort of like interconnectedness between these stories that we're probably supposed to draw out of it, because like I think you said, this volume really contains, or we were talking about, this is more of an anthology issue.
mhm.
Like there doesn't seem to be any real direct connection between any of these stories in comparison to previous volumes where every couple of stories would have some sort of connectedness. Not all of them, but some of them would.
Or a
Um,
character would weave from one in and out of another. Yeah.
yes, exactly, with the exception of Ice Cream Man, right?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I don't know, and it's interesting because I think the next issue has no connection to anything, or at least any of the other stories in this volume, unless you really disagree. But this next one is a pretty wild ride. So maybe we should get into that because we're running long on this episode because there's so much to say about Ice Cream Man, folks.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, issue 16 is called Tiny Lives, and I don't know, Nick, you want to sum this up really quick?
Yeah, so basically with Tiny Lives, you have this situation where you have a single dad who's raising his daughter. He, of course, is concerned about doing that properly, and so we find out that he's kind of going to a support group for single parents. He's kind of reaching that point with his 17-year-old teenage daughter where he's trying to let her live her own life, let her start to become sort of an independent person, become an adult, respect her, autonomy, and, not snoop and spy into everything she's doing and where she's going and if she's being safe, right? Right, except he's apparently not having the easiest time respecting those boundaries. And specifically, he goes into a room. Her name is Jen. He reads Jen's diary, and begins to realize that, Jen is, I don't know how you want to put it, basically, becoming an adult and talking about and discussing things that, I think parents are uncomfortable to have these discussions with, kids, right? About the birds and the bees and all of that, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say let's
Yeah.
just be explicit here. I mean, he's worried that she is having sex with some boys in high school because she keeps saying she wants.
Well, he's just worried at the beginning. She's having a relationship with one person,
right, and as he's reading her diaries is that she's ready to quote unquote do it. Yes, yeah. And as the story goes on, he keeps checking on this diary, even though he knows it's going against her boundaries. And she keeps talking about, oh, she did it with this boy, and now she wants to do it with another boy, and now she's going to do it with another boy, which happens to be the son of another person that's in this single fathers group, which I thought was pretty interesting.
The police officer.
Yeah, the police officer.
Mm-hmm.
But what she means by doing it isn't necessarily what you and I may think, Nick.
Right.
It's actually fucking murder.
Right. And her talking about going to the store to buy some more you-know-whats for protection, she's not talking about, protection. She's talking about knives. She's talking...
Yeah, we're not talking condoms. Right. We're talking kitchen knives.
Yeah. Which is... It's such a fucking left turn because W. Maxwell Prince, over several journal entries, really carefully, firmly sets the scene that you think this is an issue of a dad struggling to deal with his daughter's sexuality.
Yes.
He really layers it on there pretty thick to where you're like, there's no moment in your mind where you're actually even considering that this is about anything else. It's really carefully layered. And then you find out she's killing people. And what's really interesting, and we always know that W. Maxwell Prince loves to play with form, and here a lot of that is being shown through the journal entries, the form of the journal entries. You've got a quote of the day at the top, which is really interesting because when you interpret it alongside each of the journal entries, there's sort of a weird correlation. I think there's one about by Amelia Earhart, which is about, like a woman should be free to do whatever she wants and nobody should get in her way. And that's the posting where Jen is talking about how, at least the father thinks that she's going to go, have sex with 6 or 7 or 8 different guys in her school. And then the following post where we find out it's about murder, it's a Charlie Manson quote. Which again, like, it's not hard to do that. It's also kind of funny because, if you've ever been someone who owns a day planner, like a lot of these day planners have like a special like section built in that like maybe 2% of people use, and everyone else is like, fuck you, I wish I just had more space to write in what's going on my day going on. And in this like diary or planner, like that section is called like a mood board, and you write down like 3 different feelings. And like that struck me as like this is the dumb thing that like 2% of people actually use, and everyone else goes, fuck this. And there's definitely a correlation there. Like when she's like, I'm gonna go out and with this one guy, it's like, anxious and scared. And then with the post that correlates with the Manson quote, it's like, I think it's hungry for blood is what it says.
Hungry for blood.
And it's interesting because like the leader of the support group for the dad, and also what he sees on TV when he sees Ice Cream Man on TV when he comes home, is like this idea of, you have to support your kids unconditionally. You have to love your kids unconditionally. You have to trust your kids, unconditionally when they're reaching this point. And I think this issue basically takes that as far as it can go and says, okay, if you have to do those things and you find out that your daughter is going around murdering tons of people, like, are you going to push that to the limit? Like, are you going to support her unconditionally? Right? Because that's really what this issue asks. And you reach a moment where the dad discovers what she's been up to. He confronts her. You realize that the police officer's son has already alerted the authorities about what's going on after she stabs him. And the dad instead basically commits the murder and then says that he's basically going to take the fall for what's happened. And
the key thing there is that he's like, I didn't realize how easy it would be. I didn't realize how freeing it would be.
Right.
And it becomes more prevalent as, later in the issue, it looks like his daughter, Jen, has gone off to college and she's met some boy who she's probably going to kill, it seems like. And she gets a letter from her dad, and he talks about how he's going to die in a couple days because they're going to kill him. And his daughter has eclipsed him, has become bigger than him. And he realizes that has given him the ability to see beyond infinity. His soul will it will be greater than anything else. And he tells her that anything that she does is pre-approved by him. He says, you are young and life is beautiful. I'm ready now, Dad. And it's this, I feel like it's this weird cult mentality almost of, or serial killer mentality where people, they commit a murder. And I say this as someone who's listened to a bunch of podcasts about serial killers. Like, they find this moment where killing someone frees them in some way, and they feel like there are no rules to the world anymore because they're able to do anything that they want. And it's wild and dark. But I think the thing that's important here is that Ice Cream Man put this idea in the dad's head, right? In the pages before the dad goes out to find Jen killing this boy, right. he put this idea in his head that you should love her unconditionally, support her no matter what, do whatever you can to, basically raise your children up. And so he does. And I think that had essentially broke him and turned him into this serial killer monster.
Well, and it's also really twisted because if you look at the letter that the father writes to the daughter at the end, if you were to extract it from the context of being someone who's on death row and is going to get capital punishment, and if you were to remove that context and just look at it as like a father writing to his daughter who's now off at college, and he's like, oh, I'm so proud of you. You're going to go on to do great things. You're going to be bigger or better than anything I've ever been. And, I hope all of your dreams come true and I'll support you in anything. Like, it's maybe the sort of letter that a lot of kids would love to receive from their parents, when they go off to school, and it's very inspiring and heartfelt. But when you put it in the context of what's going on in the story, it's turbo fucked up.
Yeah, and this one just happens to contain a whole paragraph about how this dad's fine, that he's going to die and his soul's going to float out into the infinite blackness of void where good and evil meet at one singular point.
Right.
It's like, just totally normal, inspiring stuff.
And it's like, if you remove it from that context, you're like, oh wow, like what a great parent. He's so supportive and he's whatever. But when you fail to remove it from the context, it's like, oh my God, like what the hell?
Yeah, it's very twisted. It's very morbid. There is this bit that I do want to pull out here because, like I said, he thinks he's going to travel beyond, or travel at light speed to that final place where it's blacker than black, where all things good and evil meet at a single point and merge into one indistinguishable idea. Now that could just be wild person who's about to
Charlie
die
Manson
thoughts. Yeah, or it could be a representation of what Caleb and Ice Cream Man are. Maybe that's what I'm thinking, but who knows? Who knows? That's just me maybe extrapolating a lot from a very simple statement in the book. But that is the last issue in this volume. And man, oh man, I think that there is a central theme here. But Nick, I want to hear your thoughts on this volume on the whole. Like, what were you thinking when coming out of this volume?
Right. So in Tiny Lives, the teddy bear, appears again. Now it's just in Jen's room. We also have a pencil holder in Jen's room that's ICM brand. There's a ice cream stencil drawing on her wall. And all of that kind of gets at, for me, what I think is sort of at least some sort of an ongoing theme, because I look at this volume as a whole and I say, is there an ongoing narrative going on? Is there anything that sort of pervades these issues in the same way that volume 3 was very much an ongoing narrative? And I think it's easy to say no. I don't think it's that hard to sort of look at this and like have a gut check that says no, like this is all self-contained and separate. But I do think, and as we've gotten at this a little bit earlier, I do think that if you look at it from just a pervasiveness of Ice Cream Man, whether it's the teddy bear, whether it's the pencil holder, whether it's the cooler and the 5 and dime, whether it's the advertising over the cashier's counter and the 5 and dime, it's this idea that he just seems to be everywhere and seems to be so deeply incorporated into people's lives, almost like on a consumer level. He's almost like a brand or a franchise now. And so he doesn't have to worm his way into people's lives. He doesn't have to put on a disguise and coax people to do one thing or another or get his hands dirty. Like for me, this volume says he is so deeply enmeshed in people's everyday lives that this shit's running on autopilot now. Like he is not having to go out there and meet people and convince them to do something or take something from him or whatever, or sell ice cream to people with bugs in it. Like that doesn't have to happen anymore. This shit is like running itself now, which again, you have to parse a little bit to kind of reach that point, but I don't think it's that wild of an idea. And that's kind of what I see going on here. He has a diminished presence, but that shouldn't be a moment where you're less concerned for people. That should be a moment where you're way more concerned for people, because
Yeah.
he doesn't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's maybe the bigger narrative like theme here is that Ice Cream Man is everywhere. It's I mean, obviously he keeps showing up in stories though, right? His face is there at least at some point, but I don't think it's like you said he's directly involved. He doesn't have to be on the ground to actually be doing anything, right? Because who knows if, in the last issue Ice Cream Man was talking to just this one single dad, or was he talking to everybody? Was he on a network, or is it just a one-off thing? I think that's constantly the question that we have about Ice Cream Man is how much influence is he pushing, and at what point does it become too overt? Right, like I think going back to the werewolf story, like way back in what was it, volume 1?
Yeah,
where the little girl is,
1.
That to me feels like playing on myth and people's worry, and instead it seems like in this volume it's playing more on like the intricacies of the human, like the modern human mind, right? Like mental illness and proper parenting, and even just the loss of a loved one. I mean, that's something that's not necessarily new, but it I think in the way that Paul was trying to find some sort of salvation or an answer, it was because of the loss of due to cancer, right? That's a fairly modern thing in regards to, in comparison to like a werewolf, which is not necessarily a new thing,
right?
So I don't know, it's maybe that's the kind of theme, but I was looking at each issue from the perspective of like I think each issue was about an image, or maybe not even subverting expectations, but it was like each story being about something that could be interpreted about X that actually becomes a story about Y, right? So like the palindrome issue is a story about loss, but then I think it becomes a story about like almost acceptance in a way. The story about in the next issue, the story about
Crosswords.
About Crosswords is a story about like a broken marriage that actually becomes about how like a horrible thing reuniting a family. And Lily's story is all about not wanting to become your parent, but then fulfilling that destiny. And it's interesting because maybe that's not like an original like thought-provoking thing, but compared to other volumes of this story where it seems to just be outright madness, these issues I think have bigger like stories where X becomes Y, where a thing becomes another thing. Each of these people are transformed in each of the issues, and I know that that's maybe the case in some of the previous issues, but the fact that this whole volume is about people transforming and moving is really interesting to me, because I don't think that fits the theme of Ice Cream Man on the whole.
Well, I think also if you look at some of these, and it's not to say you don't see these themes in other stories, I'm sure in other issues, but I think with some of these stories you have this idea that obsession or fixation can sort of, like it's a machine that powers itself once it begins.
Sure.
So the moment that you fear that you're becoming your parents, or the moment that you think you've noticed something, about yourself that you think you've seen in them, like if you're someone who obsesses or fixates on things, myself included, that train drives itself from then on out. Like, sure. You don't need someone else actively running that. You don't need someone else coming into your life and giving that idea a shot in the arm. Like, that is a self-running machine at that point. And so I sort of see that in that story. If you look at the story about Rita and Earl, like this idea that you're bored, or you're not actively engaging yourself or filling your day with things, like, you start to like pick apart or dissect different things going on in your life, because there's nothing else that you're actively doing to keep your mind busy. And so your mind starts to like, oh, what are those contractors up to? Oh, they're smoking weed. So what's to say they're not doing X? What's to say they're not doing Y? Right? Like that just snowballs. That builds on itself too. I think if you, or even with the diary again, like that obsession over, oh, I need to learn more, I need to see where this is going.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Again, if you looked at volumes before this, would you find this? Probably. I don't know, but I think it's certainly more on display here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think you make a good point. I think the obsession or the focus that people have in this volume seems to be pretty pervasive. I mean, of course, the title of the volume being Tiny Lives, maybe that does kind of lean towards the more anthology style of this book, which is probably why we're not getting as much necessarily like Ice Cream Man continuity. But
and it's also
I do
the
like
name
that
of the
idea
movie
of,
on the marquee. Did you see that? And I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that.
Well, no. So each of the volumes are named after one of the issues in the volume, right? That's how it's been since the beginning. So I don't know if there's necessarily more to read into that.
Oh no, I meant like it being on the movie, the marquee, the movie theater. I didn't know if there was anything more to pull that out of the fact that was the movie they went to see. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not necessarily sure, but yeah. Anyways, this is I don't know. It's another volume of Ice Cream Man that made me feel pretty unsettled last night as I was rereading it. So, I don't know. Any last thoughts on this volume, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway I had when I finished it yesterday afternoon, because I definitely was not going to read it right before bed. I guess we all have to make our own choices as adults.
Yeah, I made
and
my own decisions.
I'm gonna respect your independence as an individual in making that choice, Michael. I think it's easy, and I think it's tempting, and it certainly was for me to finish this volume and say maybe this wasn't one of my more favorite volumes, especially because I did really enjoy 3. I thought 3 was, don't get me wrong, like I think 2, after like 1 set the right foundation for the anthology, I think 2 really hit the ground running with that and did some wild things, and I really liked that.
Yeah.
And then 3 said, all right, we're gonna maybe be more of like a conventional serialized story a little bit. It was, it was both equal parts serialized and episodic, and I liked that too. I think it's easy to look at 4 and say that it's like hyper episodic, that it's too episodic, that it doesn't have that blend of at least giving you like 80% episodic, like 20% serialized or something like that. But I think it's way too soon to talk when it comes to this.
Yeah.
I look at volume 4 as, like I've talked about with other volumes, it's like each volume sets a foundation, and then the next volume, knowing that it's already set the foundation, starts to play with it and subvert it. And I think that it's hard to judge this volume really honestly until we see volume 5, because I think this is setting something up for 5. I really do. And,
yeah,
and as you brought up earlier, like this idea that sometimes you have alternating volumes to step away from something, like maybe this is the step away from 3, so that 3 isn't ever present in our mind when they go back to it. And I've seen this with like Southern Bastards too, right? Like you have the present story about the old guy and his daughter coming home from like Iraq or whatever, but then we take a whole step back and we do a whole origins trade about what, like the coach whatever his name is, and so you get some distance from it and you get some separation, and that gives you that sort of space that you need to sort of separate from something before you return to it. And I think that that's what's going on here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that they, if we're going like odds and evens, I think the odd volumes are going to end up having more continuity. Yeah. I mean, this is all just my assumption.
That's what I think.
Even if you look at volume 1, there's still continuity in there, right? Like Caleb is introduced there early on, just to establish that there's something weird going on here, just beyond like this horror anthology. So it'll be, we will definitely have to look at volume 5. I think the next thing we also should do is look at all those quarantine comics that they did. Because the last one came out pretty recently as of the recording of this episode. And I think that there's something to be said. They're all like 4 pages each. I picked up all of them just because I'm a sucker. And so maybe we should do a quarantine special minisode where we talk about all of those before volume 5 comes out, even though I think that those little quarantine issues are going to show up in volume 5 because they're supposed to be backups for like the next few issues. But we'll see. Either way, maybe we'll take a look at those in the coming weeks. But I'd be curious to know if any of those play into it, or if they have any kind of relation, because they're only like 4 pages. So I'd be really curious to know what they planned on doing and what those stories are about. So my final thought, takeaway is I like this anthology thing. I don't think it's more Ice Cream Man that begs more questions than it answers anything, and I think that's what makes this series great, is the slow pacing in answering questions and establishing story, showing the full range of potential with the Ice Cream Man as this horror individual, kind of like a Freddy Krueger that just kind of shows up and has unchecked power to an extent, right? Because
Right.
I think that there's an interesting thing to wonder is, what is Ice Cream Man getting out of this? And if he wanted to just kill everybody, he would just kill everybody. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be his point. I think he is feeding off of emotional distraught, like negative emotions, and so he puts people through all these horrible things in order to somehow feed off of it. And I don't know what the answer is, right? Because we haven't figured out what the fuck is happening, and that's why we keep coming back to this book, despite the very clever writing bits. I think like the palindrome issue was great. The Neapolitan 3 stories in one issue was fantastic. I mean, W. Maxwell Prince and everybody who was working on this book, Martin Morazzo, Chris O'Halloran, good old Neon, I think they are really trying to push the boundary of what's capable in comic books as well as what makes a good horror story. And I think they've succeeded in both of those. I mean, I don't know of another book that's trying to do weird shit like this, other than, there's a handful of like panel syndicate books and stuff. Like, let's go read Private Eye, Nick, and get the full hardcover editions that don't make any sense to read on your table. But but that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that this is one of the rare books that's it's being published by one of the Big 10, and they're really pushing the boundaries of comics, and I think that's why we keep coming back to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess until next time, like I said, we will do some research on our end to see if we want to do an episode that's just about the quarantine comics that came out, that W. Maxwell Prince worked with a bunch of, he worked with Martin Morazzo, and he also worked with a bunch of other independent creators to do some Ice Cream Man stories that were about 4 pages each. So we'll let you guys know. It'll probably be, if we do it, it'll be much later this year. But anyways, let's wrap this thing up because we've already gone too long. You can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast and on Instagram, where I try to post sometimes.
This show and our many subscriber-only episodes are powered by fans like you on Patreon. You can join now at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. And if you haven't already, please rate and review our show, 5 stars would be great, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Don't forget to join us on Discord, where we have our semi-regular every 2 or 3 weeks book club that we've been doing on there, where we sit down and talk about a book. And make sure to tell a friend or two about the show if you haven't already. It really means a lot for you guys to spread the word, and just posting about things on Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else really, really helps the show just to get it in more people's ears. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. We can't thank them enough. Xander is a good guy, a great GM. He's a fantastic editor, and just someone who's fun to be around. He edits the show. Thank you so much, Xander. Thank you to Nick for sitting down and talking with me about Ice Cream Man. Or should I say, thank you so much, Nick, for bending my arm and making me read this series to begin with, and now I can't stop. This is a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone out there who listens to the show and hangs out with us on Discord. It's been fantastic. And until next time, stay healthy. Comics are good, and so are you.